Well, good morning, and we're really pleased this morning to have on Our Stories as our guest, Connie Requarth. And Connie has a story to tell about her grandmother that she'd like to share with us. This was your father's mother?
This was my father's mother.
Yeah, right.
Mary Madeline Moran Harper.
Okay. And, but you also just told me that you lived here in Decatur as you were growing up, but you had a bunch of relatives that lived within very close proximity, not just your grandmother, but who else was?
Both sets of grandparents were on the 1800 block of East North Street. We lived around the corner on 19th. So my grandmother was at one end and my other grandparents were at the other end.
Yeah. So physically she was easy access, very close.
Early, yeah. We moved, my dad built a house and we moved out towards the airport off of 36 East when I was 8.
Yeah, okay. Well, up until that point, you know, how often do you think you would see her and spend any time with her?
Probably every day when I was little. We often were together on weekends for dinners on Sundays. Yeah. And my dad always took my grandmother to church with us. She did not drive, and we went to St. Pat's and we would pick her up.
Yeah. So it sounds like you pretty well had quick, easy access to her, and not just access to her, but in terms of one-on-one time, it was pretty easy to come by, I would think.
It was early on. Now I'm the oldest of 8 children, so it got more complicated as time went on. Right. I think that she was a little overwhelmed by that many children, as was my mother, I believe, too. Yeah. But I did get to spend alone time with my grandmother, and her house was always so quiet compared to my house.
Yeah. Okay, can appreciate that. You know, young children really look for environments that make them feel safe. And I gather that time with your grandma was kind of filled the bill with that for you.
Yeah, it always felt very safe, and she was very affirming.
Right. I also think, not necessarily to imply there was anything bad about your parents, but just with that number of kids, it would have been more difficult for you to, you know, carve out individual adult time, or to feel maybe the same kind of safety there in that environment that you would with hers. Is that my?
Yeah, it was a safe and loving place. You know, they got along. There was not fighting, those kinds of things. But it was very difficult. My father worked a lot of long hours, of course. My mother was home, and she was a really good housekeeper. I did not inherit that trait whatsoever. But so she was busy managing the house and feeding people and those. So I became a caregiver pretty early on.
Yeah. So your recognition of her place being kind of a respite place probably took place fairly early in your life, I would guess.
I would probably so.
Yeah. And probably not necessarily consciously.
Right.
You know, I mean, it might have just been a feeling on your part of, wow, things are low.
It was a very different lifestyle. I knew what it was like at home, but my grandmother, who'd been widowed since she was 31, had a totally different kind of life. She had her own house and her own space, and she had a job, and she had work clothes, and she had friends. And you know, my mother really did not have time for most of those things.
Yeah. So she provided a sense of a woman who had a totally different lifestyle than your mother.
Right. Yeah. And so it gave me a perspective that everybody didn't have to follow the same path.
Yeah.
And she'd always wanted to be a nurse, but her father thought girls didn't need educations. And she'd stopped school at 8th grade, and he discouraged her career, and that's probably part of why I went into nursing.
So what kind of things, when you went to our house, what kind of things did the two of you do?
You know, sometimes we played cards. Sometimes we worked in her garden. She always had flowers and gardens. Sometimes we just talked, just kind of were there together. I don't think there were planned activities.
Yeah,
She
yeah.
sometimes would take me on the bus to lunch somewhere, or we would walk over to Schwartz's, which was not far from her house.
You told me that in spite of her kind of limited economic means, that she was a very giving person. What do you mean by that?
Well, she was always helping out friends. There were people that would come to her back door, men from the train. I think they used to call them hobos, but just people that rode the rails. They would stop at her back door because they knew it was a place for a handout, and she was close to Staley's and the railroad yards. And her husband had worked for the railroad before he died.
So she didn't mind giving him a handout, giving him a sandwich or
No,
whatever?
no,
Yeah.
not at all. And that's how she made a living those initial first years after he died with 2 little kids at home by cooking. She cooked meals for the teachers at Roach School for a quarter, I think, and they would walk over at lunch and could have lunch, and then she baked pies and sold those.
You also said that you thought your grandma had a pretty big impact on your dad, particularly in how he thought about women.
I think so. I think he saw how hard she struggled and how hard she worked and how successful she was at raising kids and having a job that was responsible. She worked down at the courthouse in the treasurer's office, I think, and took care of property taxes and those sorts of things. And so he always thought women were equal to men in ability, I think.
Yeah.
And he thought education was important. He didn't want to see his
Right.
daughters any less likely to be able to take care of themselves
Right.
than his sons.
Well, with the death of his dad, he saw his mom, in a situation where, she was thrust into, being the provider.
Right.
And that she had to scramble.
She did.
And I'm sure, looking at that, he probably thought, boy, if I have daughters, I want them to have education, skills, whatever, so that, if something like that happens to them, why,
Right. I'm sure that was part
know,
of it.
they've got something to fall back on. Well, you said that your mom said you were more like your grandma and not so much like her. What do you think she meant by that?
I don't know, but she would say that. You get more like your grandmother every day. And I think that meant, looking back, I think it meant I was interested in things outside of my own house. I was interested in what was happening in the world. I was interested in other people. My mother was very concentrated on the family,
Yeah.
mostly her family and the closely extended family. And my grandmother was always, she was involved in some politics. She did a precinct committee woman job. She did other things. She went to an office. I think she just felt like I was headed down a different path than she'd been.
Yeah. What's a special memory that you have of your time with your grandma?
I remember when I was 12 and she took me by myself on the train to Chicago. And I think her parents had come from Chicago, so she knew it a little bit. I don't remember much about what we did. I just remember feeling so special that I could go on the train like a grown-up,
Yeah.
with my grandmother, and we could go and get something to eat, and she could show me things around the city, and then we could take the train back home.
Yeah.
I really felt special.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that my grandmother did for me more than anything else was she got me interested in nursing. Indirectly, I don't think that was ever her intention. And for me, that opened lots of doors and led me into lots of other interesting sides. I met my first husband because I was a nurse, and that opened my world up immensely. I worked with other nurses that were wonderful, became really good friends with Phyllis, and we did a lot of mission trips together. Things I don't know that I would have been as open to had I not had somebody who'd had a vision of something
Yeah,
else
right.
early in life.
Yeah. Oddly enough, I can really relate to that because I was taken on the train to Chicago when I was 12, not by my grandmother, but by a teacher. And boy, that really sticks in my mind today, you know, as something that was, you know, I mean, it was so out of the ordinary.
Right.
He did it over Christmas vacation and took a bunch of us, and you know, I thought this guy gave up his Christmas vacation to do this
Yeah.
with a bunch of crazy junior high boys, you know?
Yeah, that is crazy.
Yeah, so.
But it does open your eyes to a bigger world, and I
Yeah.
think it's where my interest in seeing other places and going other places developed. And her interest in politics and stressing how important voting was and those kind of things made me more interested in an outside world. And then when Phyllis and I did some of the mission trips, and then later Fred would also join us on those, you know, it gives you a perspective of that bigger world. So
Yeah.
I think I would have never done the traveling I did or looked beyond, you know, Decatur as much
Right.
if I hadn't felt like that was a thing you could do.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us. It was really a terrific story and a really nice picture of your grandma for us, even though we didn't know her. Felt like we got something to relate to through your telling about her, so that was
Yeah.
really nice.
Yeah,
Thank you.
she was wonderful.